Today on BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition, it's episode 8. We're talking ULM tank cycling and then giving away one of those awesome Kessil H380s at the end. I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition. Tank Trials is all about taking everything the BRS team and reefing community knows about a very specific approach to reefing, implementing that knowledge, tracking the progress, and exploring the results. This is week 7 of ULM and development of an ultra-low maintenance system. The goal is a show caliber, stable reef tank that requires as little maintenance as possible, potentially performing only a few minutes of maintenance a month. Today is all about sharing an ultra-low maintenance method of cycling these tanks. However, we're not just talking about the easiest method of starting the nitrogen cycle. We're talking about what's going to set us up for success long-term in a more holistic approach to cycling a tank. In this case, rather than drudging through the 100 different ways to cycle a tank, we're just going to share how we're going to cycle these tanks. So I'd like to call this process the ULM cycle because it's designed to avoid many of the common issues that reefers run into to reduce the overall maintenance in the first year. The ULM cycle is based on 4 steps before we turn those lights on and start adding fish and corals. Building bacteria colonies capable of rapidly eliminating ammonia from the tank, jump-starting the natural nitrate and phosphate reduction process, building a protective barrier in the rock's surface to prevent pests from populating on it, and lastly, a healthy microfauna population to graze on any pests which may attempt to populate the rock's surface. There are certainly faster methods of doing this, but I think a relatively tiny amount of time in the beginning can set reefers up for a much easier, lower maintenance success in the long run. We are using this on a dry rock cycle, but I don't think it's specific to dry rock. A bit of time spent on the front end will reap stability benefits and increase success rates with almost any tank design. Starting with building that beneficial bacteria population, this is one of those things that you really couldn't prevent from happening even if you wanted to. Bacteria will populate the surface of the rock and rapidly process the toxic ammonia for you. It's just the speed at which it populates that rock that's in question. With today's modern reef keeping methods, this is just kind of a moot point because there's so many low-cost bacterial starter or booster products on the market. They'll more or less instantly boost the bacteria populations to quickly cycle the tank from a bacteria population perspective. Number one option is probably being Dr. Tim's one and only. More or less, dump a bottle in, add your first fish, and you're done. But they do have some more advanced approaches if you want to use them, more specifically based around building the population of bacteria before adding the fish with their fishless ammonia-dosed based cycling system. In any case, this is really about the depth of the cycle that many people discuss. With today's ULM cycle, we're going to go a few steps past that point with a more holistic approach, starting with considering what happens to all that nitrate and potentially phosphate that results from the process of breaking down the food and the bacteria processing that ammonia into safer elements. In our case, we're going to rely primarily on our refugium and algae growth for nitrate and phosphate reduction. However, simpler forms of algae can just as easily grow in the display tank as algae in the refugium. In fact, in the beginning, it's probably more likely to grow in the display because the display is often very large, brightly illuminated, and has tremendous amounts of surface area with very few predators or preventative barriers to prevent the algae from growing on it. So to combat all that, as part of our ULM cycle, we'll start with a period where there's no light in the display, but the refugium is properly illuminated. This will give the refugium and macroalgae time to acclimate to your light sources and give it a head start and make sure, long-term, the algae grows in the fuge rather than the display. As to the third component of our ULM cycle, we're also going to start the process of building a microfauna population as the base of our cleanup crew. Many reefers don't actively consider pods or microfauna a component of their cleanup crew, but in many instances, they're grazing on all the beginnings of algae before you even have a chance to see it, and potentially just as valuable, if not more valuable, than more commonly considered elements of a cleanup crew like snails and crabs. This is another one of those things where I don't think I've ever seen anyone successful at keeping microfauna like copepods and amphipods out of the tank, even if they wanted to. I'm sure it's possible, but they almost always get introduced on the rock, substrate, coral bases, frag plugs, or macroalgae like chaeto. So again, this is mostly about the speed at which they reproduce into effective numbers. Luckily, there's no shortage of pod booster products out there as well. I think one of the more notable options being Algae Barn. It's who we're going to use for our tanks because they also supply clean chaeto, meaning chaeto free of any pests. In this case, they're providing us their 3 pod species mix as their starter pod culture and live phyto as food for them for all 3 tanks. This will be our pod baseline with other species of microfauna added via introduction with coral bases or similar introduction methods. The last piece of this is reducing the available habitat for undesirable algae and other pests to grow on, partially with that general biofilm that populates the surface of the rock and protects it, but also desirable coralline algae coverage. Coralline algae is again something I don't know if I've ever seen successfully prevented from entering a tank. Some almost always comes on coral bases or plugs or accidentally introduced in some manner. I'm sure it's possible, but it'd be a rare occurrence. That said, sometimes it can be a slow grower on its own and likely not spread as fast as many reefers would like. In this case, I find scraping some off the glass or other areas of the tank, crushing it up, and seeding a new tank would be one of the more effective methods of spreading coralline algae quickly. Alternatively, you can just add a closely inspected piece of rock with coralline as well. Again, I actually find that scraping it off that rock spreads it around more rapidly. I also find that coralline grows much faster in the higher pH ranges, as well as when calcium and alkalinity are maintained properly. So that said, this is what our ULM cycle is going to look like. It'll be a 3-step process. Step 1, we just added water to the tank. I'm going to add a bottle of Dr. Tim's to boost that bacterial process. We're also going to turn on that Kessil H380 refugium light for 8 hours a night in the beginning, just for now running on that save-a-watt timer. Again, we're using the clean Chaeto the folks at Algae Barn provided us. I can't state this enough. I would absolutely find somewhere that provides a clean option without pests. Chaeto's notorious for housing pests and the introduction of those undesirable pests into the tank, most notably bubble algae, bryopsis, and aptasia. It's really awesome that there are some businesses out there that take this type of thing seriously and provide a viable alternative to getting it from other locations which very commonly have some form of pests in their systems. Related to that, we're also going to add those pods now, and half to the tank directly and half to the Chaeto, which is likely a preferred initial habitat in a brand new tank like this. I'll also dose that Fido as directed. Fido isn't something that I've bothered with before, but since they provided it, why not? Outside of that, I threw in some frozen food in various sizes so it decays at different rates. In this case, standard and jumbo mysis, and I put an automatic pellet feeder on its lowest setting to feed once daily. Lastly, I taped some tag board to the side of the tank to prevent the majority of the light from entering the tank and stunt even the beginnings of algae in the display while the fuge gets up and running. All this took about 10 minutes to do, and at this point, I'm just going to leave the tank alone for a month. There's a food source in there for the bacteria, copepods, and the refugium's macroalgae, so all three should begin the process of populating the tank. Step 2, at the end of the first month, we'll take that tag board off the sides of the tank and add my first fish and continue feeding via the auto feeder. I'd consider this completely optional, but this might be a solid time to consider Dr. Tim's EcoBalance multi-strain bacteria booster just to ensure the right bacteria strains are dominating the tank. I say optional because I've never used anything like this before and never had any issues cycling a tank before, even with much simpler approaches to this one. But it's a more holistic approach this time, and I'm going to go ahead and try it to see if I notice any differences. At this point, we'll also scrape off some coralline at the back of another tank here, crush it, and seed the tank with coralline algae. However, I'm going to leave the display lights on the tank off for a month. Coralline, surprisingly, will seed and grow with just ambient room light. This will provide us time to continue building that biofilm on the rock surface. Again, this process took about 10 minutes to set up. Step 3, turn on the display lights, but fairly low and only for a few hours a day for the next month to continue the ULM cycle process and get the tank truly ready for livestock additions. After a total of 90 days, adjust the lights to your desired level, preferably using that acclimation mode, and then go ahead and add anything that you want to the tank. Now, this 90-day ULM cycle might sound a bit more in-depth than your standard approach to cycling a tank and not sound ULM, but there's literally only 20 minutes of effort put into this, and it only needs to be touched once a month for around 10 minutes, which is our exact goal. Not only that, but for anyone that follows it, I truly believe their tanks are going to be set up for success and going to avoid many of the most common new tank issues, many of which dramatically increase maintenance managing them. The one thing I would note here is you could certainly reduce the time frame here and potentially some of the items that we intentionally added with the use of live rock rather than dry. However, if you consider the proper cleaning, cure time, effort, and cost of most decent live rock, it probably ends up pretty close in terms of cost and effort. Both options have their own merits and advocates. Don't forget, we're giving away that Kessil H380, so check out the link in the comments down below, or head on over to the site, click on Sales and Deals, then Free Stuff to sign up. So next week, we're going to do a 6-month review of the BRS-160 and how Triton is going. One of the things that we're going to discuss is, do you consider Triton to be a ULM approach to reefing? So please share your thoughts with everyone in the comments down below or over on our Reef to Reef thread. As always, if you like what we're doing here, throw us some support with a quick thumbs up and subscribe because we release new reefing videos all week long. See you next week with another BRStv Tank Trials ULM edition.